In the late spring of 1920, the Vera Treaty began to be enforced, but Germany was still engulfed in political instability and paramilitary violence. By mid-March, a general strike managed to topple the right-wing P government, but this triggered a left-wing uprising in the western province of Westphalia. At the same time, there was growing tension in the east, especially in the ethnically mixed region of Upper Kaya and the southern part of East Prussia. In these places, votes were being planned to decide whether they would join the new Polish Republic or remain with Germany. Adding further to the internal chaos, Germany was in complicated negotiations with the victorious Allies over war reparations. These were difficult and tumultuous times, where every decision seemed to have a significant impact on the country's future. All of this happened 100 years ago, and in this episode, we will explore the events that marked the summer of 1920 in the new Weimar Republic. Germany, at that time, was a cauldron of tensions and uncertainties. The fall of the right-wing P government brought brief hope, but the left-wing uprising in Westphalia soon showed that peace was far from achieved. In the regions of Upper Kaya and East Prussia, the population was divided and anxious about the political future, as the choice between the new Polish Republic and Germany would bring profound consequences. Meanwhile, the pressure of war reparations imposed by the victorious Allies placed an even heavier burden on the already fragile German economy. Negotiations were tough, and every step seemed to be a test of resilience for the country. Uncertainty hung in the air, and every political move was watched with apprehension by both leaders and the people. In this scenario of tension and uncertainty, the new Weimar Republic sought its way amidst the turmoil. The failure of the right-wing P government did not bring the expected stability, and the country seemed to be on the brink of an abyss, with internal factions in conflict and relentless external pressure. The summer of 1920 was a time of hope and despair, where every decision could change the course of history. Thus, in this episode, we will delve into the stories and events that shaped this crucial period, highlighting how Germany navigated through these turbulent times in search of a more stable and peaceful future. In mid-March, in the rural area of Western Germany, a leftist uprising changed the local political landscape. Left-wing groups, such as the Independent Social Democrats and the Communists, joined forces and formed the self-proclaimed Rural Red Army. This improvised army ended up clashing with local right-wing forces, resulting in intense battles. By the second half of March, the Rural Red Army managed to defeat its opponents and took control of an area known as the Neutral Zone, a 50 km wide strip of land near the occupied lands of the Rhine. According to the Treaty of Versailles, this region should be free from German armed forces. Despite the initial success, the revolt was not unified. Its more moderate leaders knew that control of the region would not last, so they began negotiations with the German government, which was dominated by a majority of more moderate Social Democrats. The negotiations resulted in the Bield Agreement, in which the Red Army committed to surrendering its 20,000 rifles, 300 machine guns, and various artillery pieces in exchange for political concessions to the workers. However, the absence of a unified central command in the uprising created problems. Some leaders of the Red Army pledged to continue the fight, refusing to disarm. One of the most obstinate was Gottfried Karweit, who was accused of being a provocateur in the service of the German army. Because of this division, some groups refused to follow the disarmament agreement. The communist newspaper Spartacus was outraged by the negotiations, accusing the Bield delegates of betrayal. They claimed that these delegates abandoned proletarian duty and stabbed a dagger in the back of the fighting masses of the proletariat. This atmosphere of tension and uncertainty hung in the air. The future was uncertain, and every decision seemed to carry immense weight. The streets were filled with murmurs and rumors about the next steps of the Red Army and the government. At any moment, new clashes could erupt, leaving the population in a constant state of alert. The atmosphere was charged with suspense. No one knew for sure what would come next. Germany was at a boiling point, with internal and external forces pressing from all sides. In the midst of this turmoil, people tried to carry on with their lives, but fear and hope were ever present, side by side. This was a time of great challenges and intense emotions. Each day brought a new surprise, a new obstacle to overcome. And so, history unfolded, woven with threads of courage, betrayal, and the eternal struggle for a better future. In early April, both the Communists and the Independent Social Democrats decided it was time to lay down their arms. They agreed to continue the revolution in a different manner, through a general strike. Meanwhile, the German army pressured the government to authorize an attack. Then, on April 1st, the Four Group launched a fierce attack on the city of Pilum, resulting in the deaths of about 100 people, most of them after surrendering. Chaos escalated on April 3rd when the German government, after issuing and extending an ultimatum, concluded that the leftist groups were not adhering to the Bayfeld Agreement or were doing so too slowly. They then decided it was time to act and ordered the army to attack. However, this planned advance by the German army would violate the Treaty of Versailles as it would involve entering the neutral zone. In a risky maneuver, the Germans requested permission from the Allies to enter the neutral zone. The British and Americans, with no strong interests in the region, were reluctant to take any action to prevent the German army. However, the situation was different for the French and Belgians, who had significant interests in the area and were much more concerned about the implications of this move. The tension was palpable. Suspense gripped everyone involved, as any misstep could trigger a larger conflict. The residents of Pilum lived in a state of constant fear and uncertainty, while political and military forces played a dangerous game of chess. The sounds of marching boots and shouted orders echoed in the streets, reminding everyone that peace was fragile and that war could reignite at any moment. At any moment, things could change drastically. The decision of the Allies, especially the French and Belgians, could determine the course of events. Behind-the-scenes negotiations were boiling, with everyone trying to anticipate each other's moves. Leftist leaders, still fighting for their cause, nervously watched, aware that their lives and those of their followers were hanging in the balance. It was a time of uncertainty and danger. The future seemed bleak, and no one knew for sure how this story would end. Hope and fear intertwined, creating a climate of suspense that left everyone on the brink of collapse. The fate of the city of Pilum, and perhaps the entire region, depended on the next decisions and actions of a few men in positions of power. France faced a severe economic crisis following the devastation and human losses of the war. While attempting to distance itself from its British allies, the country's position was unstable. In an effort not to be isolated, the French pressured the Belgians to join them, primarily to protect their own interests in future discussions about Luxembourg. Heeding the request, the Belgians joined the French, who began to mobilize more troops, warning the Germans that if the neutral zone were violated, they would occupy Frankfurt and other German cities, with or without British support. The German government and army, feeling threatened, decided that the risk was worth it to crush what they considered an armed Bolshevik revolt in the rural region. Some members of the German army were convinced that the French were conspiring with the rural Red Army, although there was no concrete evidence for such theories. The tension was palpable as the German army advanced. Although there were sporadic skirmishes, they managed to secure control of the southern region up to the river within just a week. At this point, the German government ordered its forces to halt. However, General Oskar von Foner, who was in command, was not satisfied with what he considered civil interference in military affairs and wanted to continue advancing. The situation was critical, and the suspense grew each day. The conflict between the civilian government and the military reflected the difficulty some German officers had in accepting the new political reality of the country. Uncertainty hung in the air, and everyone knew that any false move could trigger a new wave of violence. The residents of the affected regions lived in fear, aware that their lives were hanging by a thread. The streets were filled with soldiers and military vehicles, and the sound of marches and commands echoed everywhere. Families prepared for the worst, while political and military leaders played a dangerous game of power. Each day, the tension increased, and the feeling that something big was about to happen kept everyone in suspense. The future was uncertain, and the fragile peace could unravel at any moment. France, the Belgians, the Germans, and everyone involved were in a state of nervous anticipation, knowing that the fate of their nations was at stake. The fate of Europe seemed to hang by a thread, and the world watched with apprehension, waiting to see how this dramatic story would unfold. The emotion was in the air, and everyone knew that the next steps would be crucial in determining the course of events. The German government, remaining firm under civilian Republican control, resisted Botha's demands. Finally, on April 27th, Botha resigned. Instead of the army, a paramilitary police force known as EZPIJ crossed the river. This force began arresting insurgents and collecting the weapons that were being surrendered. At the same time, the FREP also crossed the river and occupied itself with painting swastikas on Jewish businesses, synagogues, and Jewish headstones. The situation became even more tense as many of the leftists fled. Between 2,000 and 3,000 of them ended up in the British occupation zone, but more than 15,000 sought refuge in the neutral zone, out of reach of the German army. Of the thousands who were arrested, about 1,200 were held in a former prisoner of war camp from the Great War. The revolt in the RAR was brutally crushed, but the consequences were severe for Germany. About 1,500 German citizens lost their lives in the fighting, most of them on the side of the leftists. This weakened the support base for the army and the FR Corps among the working class. In the June 1920 elections, the majority Social Democrats lost 1/3 of their seats and the chancellorship. On the other hand, the more radical independent Social Democrats and, eventually, the Communists were strengthened. While all this was happening, the French decided to act due to the violation of the neutral zone by German forces. The tension rose with each moment, with everyone watching the unfolding events closely. The atmosphere was dense with suspense and uncertainty. In the streets, people whispered about the latest developments, fearing what might come next. The sound of military marches and sirens echoed through the cities, heightening the sense of fear and expectation. Inside homes, families gathered around radios, waiting for news. Each report brought a new wave of worry. Anxiety was present in every conversation, in every exchanged glance. The war and violence had left deep scars, and now the country seemed on the brink of another devastating conflict. French officers were not willing to let the violation of the neutral zone go unanswered. They began to mobilize their troops, ready to act. The German government was aware of the risk, but felt it needed to crush what it considered a Bolshevik threat. Negotiations were tense, with each side holding its positions. The feeling that a storm was about to break was almost palpable. With each passing day, the situation became more critical, and the world watched with growing apprehension. The uncertainty of the future weighed on everyone. The choices made in the coming weeks could change the fate of entire nations. The delicate balance of peace and war was about to break, and no one knew for sure what the next step would be. The story unfolded with an intensity that kept everyone on the edge of their seats, awaiting the outcome of a drama that could define Europe for decades. On April 6th, forces commanded by General Jean-Marie Dutt advanced and occupied Frankfurt and several nearby cities, against the wishes of the British. French Prime Minister Alexandre Miron explained France's rationale. The French government felt compelled to act upon realizing a treaty violation that affected all the Allies, especially France due to its geographical location. France was also dealing with the fact that the German government had broken its promise, made personally during the negotiations. The German citizens of these occupied cities were not pleased with the arrival of the French troops. However, the French were determined to send a clear message. Chief of Staff General Edmond Buat wrote in his diary, "Everything is going well, at least to start. I hope the troop trains running through the Rhineland make the Boche understand that this time we are serious." In Frankfurt, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. A crowd of German citizens gathered to protest the arrival of the French-Moroccan troops. The tension escalated, and in a moment of chaos, the French troops opened fire, resulting in the deaths of 9 Germans and injuring another 26. The French newspapers attributed the incident to provocations from the German government in Berlin. They claimed that suddenly, an order from Berlin stirred the population, which quickly turned into aggression, forcing the French soldiers to use their weapons in self-defense. The atmosphere was charged with emotion and suspense. In the streets, whispers and worried glances were common. People discussed what might happen next, fearing an escalation of violence. Inside homes, families gathered around radios, waiting for news that could change their lives. The French were aware of the risk they were taking but felt they had no choice but to act. Negotiations were intense, with each side firmly holding their positions. The sense that a new storm was about to form hung in the air. The uncertainty of the future weighed on everyone, and every decision made in the coming days could have devastating consequences. Meanwhile, the world watched with apprehension. The French occupation was a bold move that could redefine alliances and conflicts in Europe. The tension between nations was on the verge of breaking, and no one knew for sure how the situation would unfold. With each moment, the suspense grew, and the story unfolded with an intensity that kept everyone attentive and worried. For the German government and press, the incident in Frankfurt was considered a massacre of innocents, perpetrated by troops they viewed as an inferior and bloodthirsty race. The Germans questioned why the French had sent these North African soldiers to Germany in the first place. This perspective was widely disseminated at the time, with war propaganda historian Nicolas Buper explaining the French rationale behind this decision. For French politicians and military leaders, the occupation of Germany was justified by their victory in the war and the peace treaty. They felt free to choose the means of implementing this occupation, and the deployment of colonial troops allowed for a quicker demobilization of French metropolitan units. Moreover, it was a way to show the Germans, who had just lost their own colonies, that France was not just a neighboring country, but a global power with forces spread around the world. The incident in Frankfurt quickly triggered a German propaganda campaign to defame the French colonial troops. This was not new. During the war and the occupation of the Rhineland that began in 1919, there had already been similar defamation. From the spring of 1920, the idea of a Schwarzschmack or black shame made headlines across Germany and was discussed in parliament. Tension was in the air, and the streets buzzed with whispered conversations about the events. In homes and cafes, people discussed fervently, fearing what might come next. The situation was on the verge of collapse, with emotions running high and a sense of injustice permeating German society. The British press also adopted the idea of the black shame, putting significant pressure on France. The situation was becoming untenable, with France being forced to justify its actions. Public indignation was growing, and the atmosphere was charged with suspense, as if something could explode at any moment. Meanwhile, French leaders were trying to maintain control. They knew that every move would be crucial and that the world was watching. The decisions made in the corridors of power in Paris could have enormous repercussions, both internally and in international relations. The feeling of walking a tightrope was constant, and every word spoken, every order given, was heavy with uncertainty and fear. The propaganda campaign and international pressure were shaping events in an almost uncontrollable way. The story was unfolding with an intensity that kept everyone in suspense, not knowing what the next day would bring. In such a volatile scenario, every moment was laden with emotion and expectation, making it impossible to predict the outcome of this complex and tense situation. The colonial troops were the target of terrible accusations, ranging from violence to rape. At the time, these allegations were widely believed, despite lacking foundation in the French army's investigations, then or in historians' research since. The resulting scandal shook international relations, tarnishing France's reputation. These accusations deeply damaged French policy in the occupied Rhineland. The goal was to win the support of the local population, but the actions of the colonial troops undermined this attempt. On May 17, French troops withdrew from Frankfurt and other cities after the German army had left the neutral zone a few days earlier. This turbulence exacerbated tensions between Germany and the Allies, especially regarding compliance with the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The halt in the production and transportation of German coal, essential for reparations owed to Belgium and France, only intensified the stalemate. The issue of Germany's financial reparations was also far from resolved. Discussions on these matters were brought to the Spa Conference in July 1920, but uncertainty hung over the outcome of these negotiations. The political and economic future of Europe was at stake as nations tried to navigate through a period of instability and uncertainty. It was a historic occasion when the Allies and Germans met again to negotiate, marking the first time since pre-war times. The outcome of this conference, known as the Spa Agreement, addressed some of the outstanding issues surrounding the treaty. A key point was the commitment to reduce and disarm the German army by 1921. Additionally, the details of coal shipments were meticulously defined, including an interesting clause. The Allies would provide food to German workers in exchange for being able to specify the exact type of coal to be sent to Belgium and France. Regarding financial reparations, it was decided that 52% would go to France, 22% to Great Britain, 10% to Italy, and 8% to Belgium. However, the total amount of these reparations was still under debate, adding further difficulties to the already tense situation in Germany. While the Spa Conference was underway, the first of two plebiscites in Germany took place on July 11th. In the regions of Allenstein and Marienwerder, in the southern part of East Prussia, the inhabitants voted to decide whether to remain in Germany or join Poland. Despite being an ethnically mixed region, with a significant portion speaking Polish, more than 90% of the voters chose to remain in Germany. This decision reflected the will of many in the region, reinforcing their bond with the country amid a period of uncertainty and change. In the next vote, the contested region of Upper Kaya, an area with a complex history and a unique identity, was at stake. Before 1918, it belonged entirely to Germany, but was also partially claimed by Poland. The population was a mix of about 60% Polish speakers and 40% German speakers, creating an atmosphere of linguistic diversity. Additionally, Upper Kaya had a distinct identity, rooted in Catholicism and tense relations with Protestant Prussia. The locals also had a habit of using both German and Polish in daily life, reflecting a rich cultural heritage. For many inhabitants, being from Upper Kaya was more than just being German or Polish. As highlighted by local author B in one of his works, being an Upper Kayanian was an identity of its own, independent of external claims. The tragedy lay in the fact that, whatever the outcome, they would face injustice. Tensions between Germans and Poles in the region gradually increased, especially after the start of the war, which severely affected the local industry and exacerbated ethnic divisions. Many Polish-speaking Kayanians, who were previously patriots, became activists after the armistice and the creation of the new Polish Republic. Although both sides based their claims on nationalist grounds, the real interest lay in the region's natural resources. The mines and mineral deposits of Upper Kaya were the true prize, contested by both Germany and Poland, each creating its own paramilitary forces to reinforce their claims. In August 1919, tension between Germans and Poles reached a critical point in the region. The spark was a clash between a German militia and striking Polish workers, resulting in the death of 10 people. German soldiers were quickly sent to quell the uprising, but the violence persisted. In early 1920, an Allied force composed of Italians and French attempted to intervene in the region, led by French General Jules Gratier. However, even with a contingent of 5,000 Italians and 15,000 French, they failed to halt the cycle of violence. German paramilitaries, known as Zittpoit, hindered local political organization, further fueling the chaos. In August 1920, during an attempt to send French supplies to Poland, another violent clash occurred. A German protest against the convoy escalated into a bloody skirmish with local Poles. French troops responded with force, resulting in more deaths. Journalist Koren called for an end to the German paramilitaries and incited the Poles to revolt. The situation was further complicated by the ambiguity of French actions, which aimed to strengthen Poland and weaken Germany. The atmosphere of instability and escalating violence heightened tension in the region, as German and Polish communities faced an uncertain future. The summer of 1920 came to an end, yet Germany still found itself embroiled in a deep crisis. Tensions with the Allies persisted as the country grappled with internal upheavals. The Social Democratic Party was weakened by its cooperation with the army and the suppression of labor uprisings, leaving room for radical leftists to strengthen their influence. Amidst this, The Führer militia remained a destabilizing force, especially in eastern Upper Kaya. Even after the March 1921 vote, which saw the majority of voters opt for remaining in Germany, the situation remained uncertain. To further complicate matters, a new round of civil war seemed imminent. Despite efforts to establish a locally and ethnically contested police force, the cycle of violence, kidnappings, and assassinations persisted, plunging the region into a sort of underground warfare. During this tense period, Germans created the Upper Kaya Defense Force, directly supported by the German army, in an attempt to sway the outcome of the plebiscite. However, uncertainties loomed, and Germany was far from finding a solution to its internal and external problems. As Germany grappled with its internal and external struggles, tensions continued to escalate. Violence persisted in the streets, with rival groups clashing in increasingly frequent confrontations. Fear and uncertainty loomed over the population, feeding a climate of distrust and paranoia. Meanwhile, the Allies closely watched the events unfolding in Germany, concerned about the impact that political and social instability could have on the region and the world. Negotiations for the implementation of the Bai Treaty dragged on, with both sides struggling to reach an agreement that satisfied their interests. As diplomacy remained at an impasse, ordinary citizens bore the brunt of the consequences. The economy was unstable, prices soared, and unemployment rose. Families struggled to survive amid the chaos unfolding around them. In this landscape of turbulence and despair, charismatic and extremist leaders emerged, ready to capitalize on popular dissatisfaction and promote their own agendas. Meanwhile, in the shadows, hidden forces plotted their own schemes, taking advantage of the chaos to advance their interests. As the world watched with apprehension, Germany found itself on the brink, with the fate of an entire nation hanging in the balance of uncertainty and conflict. What the future held for this land plagued by pain and turmoil, only time could tell. As tension mounted, charismatic leaders emerged, some promising stability and order, while others incited chaos and rebellion. The division in German society deepened, with families and communities torn between loyalties and conflicting ideologies. Meanwhile, behind the scenes of power, games of influence and manipulation were in full swing. Underground groups conspired to gain advantage, while spies and secret agents wove their webs of intrigue. As diplomatic negotiations stalled, danger lurked around every corner. Assassinations and political murders became a common occurrence, and fear ruled the minds of those who dared challenge the status quo. As the world watched with apprehension, Germany found itself on the brink, with the fate of an entire nation hanging in the balance of uncertainty and conflict. And on the dark horizon, a storm was brewing, ready to unleash a new wave of turmoil and destruction. As the story unfolds and the winds of change sweep over the German nation, the protagonists of this saga face choices that will shape the destiny of all. Amidst the chaos and uncertainty, unlikely heroes emerge, seeking redemption and hope for a better future. As we approach the conclusion of this epic tale, I invite you to join us on this thrilling journey. Don't miss any detail of this incredible story. Be sure to leave your like on this video and subscribe to the General Jack channel to not miss any chapter of this grand saga. Share this exciting narrative with your friends and family, and together let's unravel the mysteries of the past and forge a future of peace and prosperity. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. Until the next episode.